There's a kind of love that doesn't make a sound. It's the weight of a small, warm body pressed against your ribs in the dark. The slow rise and fall of breathing that isn't your own. For Tessa, that love had a name. Scout. A scruffy dog with one torn ear and eyes that found her across every crowded, joyless room. He was the one good thing in the world that felt like hers. So when the man who ran the orphanage looked at Scout and called him a thing we no longer have room for, something inside Tessa went very still. He didn't shout. He never shouted. He simply wrote it down, the way you'd cross an item off a list. The dog would be gone by noon. Tessa was 18. She had spent her whole life learning to be quiet, to take up no space, to want nothing. That night, she stopped being quiet. She wrapped the dog in her coat and walked toward the one place the whole town swore would kill her, the ravine beyond the ridge, the forbidden one, the one no one came back from. She didn't know what waited in those shadows. She only knew she would rather face it together than lose him alone. Some places teach you to be small. The house on the hill was one of them. It stood at the edge of a quiet town, where the paved roads gave up and turned to gravel, where the gravel gave up and turned to grass, and where the hills folded over one another like the pages of a book somebody had closed a long time ago and forgotten to open again. From the outside, it looked respectable. Clean white walls, straight rows of windows that caught the morning light and gave nothing back. A garden out front, trimmed so neat and square that the flowers seemed almost afraid to bloom out of turn. Inside, the children learned the rules without anyone ever needing to say them out loud. Don't take up space. Don't ask for more than you're given. And don't ever love anything too much, because anything you love can be taken. Tessa had lived by those rules for as long as her memory reached back. She was 18 now, old enough to leave, the older ones whispered when the lights went out. Old enough that the house would soon decide it had no further use for her. But there was nowhere in the wide world for a girl like that to go. And so she stayed. She stayed the way a single leaf stays on a branch in the late autumn, still hanging on, even when the wind has already made up its mind. She was the quiet one, the girl who finished her chores before anyone thought to ask, the girl who slipped down to the laundry at night to mend the little one's torn clothes by candlelight so they wouldn't be scolded in the morning, the girl whose voice you could go a whole week without hearing and never notice the silence. People who looked at her saw an empty thing, a girl with no fire in her. They were wrong. Behind those gray eyes was a whole world, a stubborn, flickering, secret world that had refused through all those gray years to go out. And that world had a name. Scout. He had wandered in 2 winters before. A half-starved pup with one torn ear and ribs you could count beneath his fur. He'd come limping out of the cold like the weather itself had thrown him away, and stood shivering by the kitchen door, asking the world for one small kindness. The cook wanted to chase him off. The matron said to leave him be, he'd wander away on his own. The other children had been told, in that flat house voice, to pay him no mind. But Tessa hid him. She tucked him into the crawl space behind the kitchen where the warm pipes ran along the wall. She carried him scraps from her own plate, going hungry herself so the small thing wouldn't have to, She lay awake on the cold floor with her palm pressed flat against the boards, just to feel him breathing on the other side of the wood. And slowly, so slowly, she didn't see it happening. That scruffy, throwaway pup grew into something neither of them had a word for. He became the warm weight against her ribs in the dark, the wet nose that found her hand when the days were too heavy to carry, the one creature in that whole tall house who looked at her and saw a person, not a chore, not a line in a book, a person worth staying alive for. When the world counted her as nothing, Scout made her feel like she was worth something. That was a dangerous kind of love to carry in a place like that, because the man who ran the house did not believe in anything he couldn't measure. His name was August Crane. He was not a loud man. That was the first thing people noticed about him, and the very last thing they ever understood. He didn't shout. He didn't raise a hand. He moved through the long halls with a slow, unhurried grace, his shoes whispering over the polished floor, a thin, silver-handled cane tapping out a soft and patient rhythm in front of him. Tap, tap, tap. The children learned to feel that sound in their teeth before they ever saw the man it belonged to. Crane believed in order, in usefulness, in a tidy world where every single thing had its proper place and its proper price. He spoke of the children, when he spoke of them at all, as an investment. He spoke of kindness the way other men spoke of rot, as a soft weakness that would, in time, ruin a person, leave them unfit for the hard road ahead. He told himself he was teaching them to survive. What he was really teaching them was to stop hoping. He kept ledgers, long, narrow books filled with names and numbers in a careful, slanting hand. To August Crane, a child was a line on a page, a cost set against some future return he had already calculated. At night, he would walk the dormitory rows, not to soothe a bad dream, not to pull a blanket up over a small cold shoulder, but to count. His pale eyes would move across the sleeping bodies the way a merchant's eyes move across his stores, measuring, tallying, making sure nothing had been lost. And somewhere in all that careful counting, he had begun to notice a line that would not balance. There was a dog in his house, a dog he had not approved, a dog eating food he had not set down in any column, a dog that had taught one of his quietest, most obedient, most useful girls to do the one thing he could not abide. It had taught her to smile when she thought no one was watching. That, more than the food, more than the dirt, was the thing he meant to put right. The morning it happened began the way every morning began. Gray light through the tall windows, cold floors under bare feet, the thin, watery smell of porridge drifting down the corridor like a sigh. Tessa was kneeling in the washroom, working a needle through the torn knee of a boy's only good shirt. He was small, 6, maybe 7, with a gap in his smile where a front tooth used to be. He had fallen the day before, playing where he shouldn't, and torn the cloth clean through. He'd come to her with his lip trembling, because he knew what a torn shirt meant in that house, and he knew that Tessa fixed things. So she fixed it, quietly, carefully, the way she fixed most things, in the spaces where no one was looking. She didn't hear the cane until it was nearly on top of her. Tap, tap, tap. She looked up, and there he stood, filling the doorway, immaculate as ever, his hands folded one over the other atop that silver handle. He did not look at the shirt. He looked at her. Tessa, he said, and her name in his mouth always sounded like the closing of an account. Come and see me in my study when you've finished here. That was all. But she had lived beneath that roof long enough to read the weather behind his eyes. Soft words from August Crane were the most dangerous words of all. His study smelled of leather and old paper, and something faintly bitter underneath, like cold tea left sitting too long in a forgotten cup. He sat behind a wide, dark desk, a ledger open in front of him. He did not offer her a chair. He let her stand there in the middle of the floor while he finished a column of figures, the scratch of his pen the only sound in the room. Then, at last, he set the pen down. There is an animal in this house, he said. Just like that. No anger in it. No accusation. He might have been remarking on the rain. Tessa's heart fell straight through the floor. She said nothing. Saying nothing had kept her safe for 18 years. It would not be enough to save her now. A dog, he went on, folding his pale hands together, eating what is not his, sleeping where he has no business sleeping, bringing dirt and noise and disorder into a house that can afford none of the three. He tilted his head a fraction, studying her, the way a man studies a smudge he has already decided to wipe away. You've grown attached to it. I understand. Attachment is a natural enough failing, but a house like this one cannot carry failings for long. He doesn't cost you anything, Tessa said. The words were out before she could call them back. Small. Cracked at the edges. The first full sentence she had spoken to him in longer than she could remember. Crane smiled. And it was a terrible thing, that smile, because there was no cruelty in it anywhere. There was only certainty. Everything costs something, he said almost gently. You simply haven't learned yet how to read the ledger. He picked his pen back up and turned his eyes down to his book. The dog will be gone by noon. The arrangement is already made. Consider it a lesson. The sooner you stop loving the things you cannot keep, the gentler your life will be. He began to write again. She had been dismissed. She walked back down the long corridor in a kind of fog. Noon. The word kept time with her footsteps, beating against the inside of her skull. Noon. 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 She found Scout in his warm hiding place behind the kitchen, curled in the dark where the pipes ran. His torn ear flicked up the instant he heard her step. His tail began to thump against the boards. He had no idea. To him, this was just one more morning. And she had just come back to him the way she had come back 1,000 mornings before. He had no notion of arrangements, or ledgers, or noon. He only knew that the one good thing in his small world had returned. And that was enough to fill him with joy. She sank down beside him and pressed her face into his fur and breathed him in. And in that quiet, in that dark, something inside Tessa shifted. For 18 years she had been good. She had bent. She had folded herself down into the smallest possible shape, telling herself that if she was only quiet enough, useful enough, invisible enough, then the world might finally agree to leave her be. It had not worked. Not once. And now the world had simply come, on a gray, ordinary morning, to take away the last warm thing she had left. She lifted her head. Her eyes were dry now. The fog had burned clean away, and what lay underneath it was harder than tears, older than tears, something that had been waiting very patiently, a very long time, for a reason to wake. She was done being small. She moved through the rest of that morning without quite deciding to. A heel of bread slipped into the pocket of her apron, a battered tin cup, a thin wool blanket folded tight and small, an old canvas bag she had patched and repatched in secret over the years, telling herself the whole time that it was nothing, that she was only mending, the way she always mended. Maybe some quiet part of her had been getting ready for this very day far longer than she had ever let herself know. She waited until the house had gone dark and still. There was a window at the far end of the east hall that had never latched right. She had known about it for years and had not once used it. Tonight, she eased it open, slow and silent, and the cold night air came rushing in to meet her like something alive. She lifted Scout up into her arms. "You have to be quiet now," she breathed into his torn ear. "Quiet, like me. Just this once. Just tonight." And the strange thing, the thing she would turn over in her mind for a long time afterward, was that he understood. He pressed himself against her chest and went perfectly still. No whine, no bark, only the quick, steady drum of his heart against hers. Two small, frightened, throwaway things, deciding together to be brave. She climbed out into the dark. Behind her, the house on the hill stood clean and silent and orderly, every line of it in its proper place. Ahead of her, the hills rose up, black against a sky scattered thick with stars, and somewhere beyond those black hills lay the one place in all the world that the town would not dare to follow. The ravine. They called it forbidden. The grown folk said the word in lowered voices, the way you speak of a thing best left untouched. "Bad air down there," they'd murmur. "Poisoned water." A place where the earth itself had turned against the living, where the cold mist crawled up out of the deep and swallowed whatever was foolish enough to wander in. Children were warned off the ridge before they were old enough to walk it. No one Tessa had ever known had set foot down inside it, and no one had ever come climbing back out to say what waited there. To most folk, all of that made the ravine a place of fear, but to a girl with nowhere left in the world to go, it made the ravine the only door that wasn't locked against her. She climbed through the dark, following a faint deer track that wound up and up toward the ridge. The town fell away behind her, its few scattered lamps growing small, then smaller, until at last they were no more than embers, winking out one by one as the hills rose between her and the life she was leaving. Her arms ached, her legs burned with each step. The bag dragged hard at her shoulders, and Scout shifted against her chest, warm and trembling, as the climb went on. Twice she stopped, certain she could hear something behind her. A soft sound down among the rocks, a patient tap, 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 like the tip of a cane finding its way over stone. Each time she turned, and each time there was nothing there, only the wind moving through the dry grass, and her own fear, dressed up in the shape of footsteps. She told herself he would not follow. A man like Crane did not chase a thing through the dark. He sent others to do his chasing. Or he simply sat back and waited, calm as still water, certain that in time the world would hand him back whatever had slipped from his grip. That thought ought to have steadied her. Somehow, it did the opposite. By the time she reached the lip of the ridge, the sky had begun to go soft and pale along its eastern edge. She stood there a moment, breathing hard, and looked down. And for that one moment, she forgot to be afraid. The ravine opened below her like a great green secret the world had been keeping all along. Deeper than she had pictured, wider. A slow river of pale mist coiled along its hidden floor, smoothing over whatever lay beneath. Ancient pines clung to the steep walls, their branches heavy with hanging moss, their roots gripping the bare rock like old hands that had decided, long ago, not to let go. The air that rose up to meet her there was not foul. It was cool, and damp, and alive. It carried the smell of rich earth and green growing things, and underneath all that, something older, something patient, something that had been here long before any town had a name, and would go on being here long after. It did not smell, in any way, like a place that killed. She didn't understand that. Not then. She only felt it, deep in her chest. The way you sometimes feel that a story you've been told your whole life might not, after all, be true. She held Scout a little tighter against her. Then, as the first thin light came spilling over the rim of the world, she started down, into the very place that everyone she had ever known had told her she must not go. The first days were hard in a way she had no words for. Hunger, she knew. The house had taught her hunger well. But this was a different creature. This was a hunger with no bell to end it, no thin bowl waiting at the bottom of it. Out here, food was a thing you found, or a thing you didn't. The bread lasted a day and a half if she was careful. And she was very careful, breaking off pieces so small they hardly earned the name, and sharing every one of them with Scout. After the bread was gone, there were berries, sour, unfamiliar things she tasted one cautious bite at a time, waiting to see if they'd turn her stomach before she dared to swallow a whole handful. There were pale roots she half remembered from an old book of plants, bitter on the tongue, and never near enough to fill the hollow inside her. Thirst was the worse of the two. The mist made the whole world damp, but damp was a long way from drink. She learned to press her cracked lips to the broad leaves at dawn, and gather what little dew had gathered there. She learned to follow the faint thread of water sound through the rocks until she found it, a thin trickle weeping down a wall of moss, and she would crouch there for long, patient minutes, catching it drop by drop in her cupped and shaking hands. Scout drank first. He drank first every time. She saw to that. And yet, it would not be true to say those first days held only suffering, because something else was happening too. Something quiet. Something she did not even notice had begun until it was already well underway. Out here, no one was counting her. No bell told her when to rise and when to lie down. No cold voice measured out her worth each morning. No narrow book waited to record everything she ate and everything she touched and every single way she had failed to be enough. For the first time she could remember, The silence around her was not a punishment laid down on her shoulders. It was hers. She moved through the old trees like a shadow, and Scout moved at her side, and between the two of them there grew a language that had no need of words. His ears would lift, and she would stop. His nose would test the air, and she would change her course. He was her warning bell now, her compass, her small, four-legged guardian in a wild and watching place. And she was his hands, his shelter, his reason to keep putting one paw in front of the other. They were two creatures the world had decided it could do without, and out here, in the green and breathing quiet, they were both beginning to learn a thing the house had never taught them. That thrown away was not the same as worthless. On the third day, she found the cave. It wasn't much to look at, a shallow hollow scooped out of the rock, high up on the western slope, half hidden behind a hanging curtain of ivy. But it was dry, and it sat with its back to the wind, and from its narrow mouth she could see anyone who came climbing up the slope toward her, long before they ever arrived. She made it theirs. She spent hours clearing the loose stone from the floor, her raw fingers aching with the work until the small space was smooth and clean and ready. She gathered fallen branches and stripped them soft and built up a bed in the driest corner. She hauled flat rocks, one by one, to make a ring for a fire she did not yet dare to light. When it was finished, she sat back on her heels and looked at what her own two hands had made. A den. Not a home. Not yet. But it was hers. She had built it, and no man with a silver pen could take it from her with a single line drawn through a book. Scout turned 3 slow circles on the new bed, let out a long and contented sigh, and curled himself down into a perfect comma of black and tan. And Tessa felt a thing she had not felt in a very, very long time. A small, fragile, blooming kind of pride. She had survived. She had provided. Out here, she was no foundling. She was no number waiting its turn to be crossed off a page. She was a girl who could keep one warm thing alive. And for now, for tonight, that was enough. The days settled into a rhythm all their own. Mornings were for scouting, for tracing the slow seeps of water through the rock, for marking the patches where the berries grew thickest, for learning, inch by inch, the shape of her small wild kingdom. Afternoons were for the work of staying alive, mending the shelter, gathering wood, and sometimes simply sitting very still and listening to the great ravine breathe around her. Evenings, when the cold came pouring down off the high rim like a tide, she and Scout pressed close together beneath the thin wool blanket and watched the stars come out, slow and uncountable, scattered across a sky so wide it made her chest ache. It was a hard life, a spare one, every mouthful earned, every drop of water won, but there was a clean and plain honesty to it. An honesty the tall white house had never once offered her in all her years beneath its roof. The fear, though, did not leave her entirely. In the deepest dark of the night, she would still startle awake, her heart slamming, certain she had heard it, that soft tap of a cane finding its way over stone. She knew, underneath all her new freedom, that a man like August Crane did not simply let a thing go missing from his books. She was a loose thread in his neat and ordered cloth. An item that had walked clean off the page. He could not let that stand, not because he wanted her back, but because if one thread could work itself free, the others might begin to wonder whether they could pull free too. She pushed the thought down each time it rose. There was nothing she could do about that man tonight. Tonight there was only the cave and the dog and the wide and watching stars and the strange, unfamiliar feeling of being, at long last, exactly where she had chosen to be. And then, on the 5th morning, something happened that she could not explain. She woke at first light, the way she did now, with Scout warm and heavy against her side. She lay still a moment, listening. The ravine was quiet. The mist hung low along the floor. Everything was as it should be. Then Scout lifted his head. His ears came up. His nose began to work the air, quick and sharp, and a low sound started up in his chest. Not quite a growl. Something nearer to a question. Tessa sat up, and that was when she saw it. There, on the flat gray stone just beyond the curtain of ivy, where there had been nothing at all the night before, sat a small parcel. She went cold and still all over. Her hand found Scout's neck on instinct, holding him quiet, holding them both back in the deep shadow of the cave. It was wrapped in oilcloth, tied off with a length of plain twine, and it had been set down with care, square in the middle of the stone, placed in the one spot where a girl waking in that cave would be certain, sooner or later, to find it. Her first thought was a trap. Crane. His people. They had found her, after all. This was how it would start. A small thing, left out to draw her into the open, to make her careless, to learn the shape of her hiding place before they came up the slope with their ropes and their orders. So she stayed back, deep in the dark, and she watched. She watched for a long, long time. The light grew stronger. The mist shifted and thinned. A hawk cried out, somewhere high above the rim, but no figure stepped out from the trees. No glint of glass caught the sun. No rustle moved that did not belong to the wind. The ravine simply held its breath and waited there beside her. Scout whined, low in his throat. His nose had caught hold of something on the air, and now his whole body strained toward that little bundle, trembling with want. And then she caught it too. The smell, warm and rich. Smoked meat, real food, the kind she had not tasted in days, the kind that made her empty stomach clench so hard it was very nearly pain. Slowly, slowly, she crept forward. She found a long stick first, and used it to poke at the bundle from a careful distance, half expecting it to spring some hidden snare. Nothing happened. She nudged it nearer. Still nothing. And when at last her fingers closed around the twine, they were shaking. She untied it. Inside lay strips of dried meat, and beside them, wrapped on their own, a small bundle of broad green leaves that she knew from her old book of plants, the kind a body steeps in water to bring a hard fever down. It was no trap. It was a gift of food, a gift of medicine, a gift, plain and simple, of life itself, left out for a girl who, by every cold rule she had ever been handed, the world had no good reason to keep breathing. She sat back on her heels, the little parcel cradled in her lap, and her mind ran in circles. Who? Crane's people did not leave gifts. They came with nets, and with that soft and terrible certainty of his, they did not feed the things they had been sent to fetch. No, this was something else, something gentler than that, and somehow the gentleness frightened her almost more than a trap would have, because a gift this careful set down this precisely, near enough to be found, but not so near as to give away the very mouth of her cave. That meant one thing she could not reason her way around. Someone knew that she was here. Someone had been watching her struggle up the slope, watching her build her small den with bleeding hands, watching her go hungry and thirsty and brave, and choosing, for some reason she could not begin to guess at, not to harm her at all, choosing, instead, to help. She turned slowly where she crouched, her eyes moving over the green walls of the ravine, over the dark spaces between the ancient trees, over the high ledges half lost in drifting mist. There was no one, only the trees, only the silence, only that prickling, undeniable feeling along the back of her neck, the old animal certainty of being watched by eyes she could not find. She should have run. Every hard lesson she had ever learned was telling her to run. But she was so tired, and so very hungry. And the smell of that meat was the smell of one more day on the right side of the ground. So that evening, as the cold came down, and the first stars pierced the deepening blue above the rim, she knelt by her ring of stones and lit a small, careful fire. And she shared one strip of that meat with Scout. It was the finest thing she had tasted in all her hard and hungry life. She rationed the rest, hoarding it close like treasure. This impossible kindness in a place the whole world swore was empty of any such thing. And as she lay down at last, Scout warm against her side, the little fire burning low to embers, she stared up at the dark mouth of the cave, and let one question turn slowly over and over and over in her mind. The question that would carry her into everything still to come. Who was out there? And what could they possibly want with a thrown-away girl and her dog in a place where, supposedly, nothing good had drawn breath in a very long time? She did not have the answer. Not yet. But the answer was out there, waiting for her, somewhere in the deep green folds of that forbidden place. And when at last she found it, it would change their fate in ways the girl in the cave could not yet begin to dream. The gifts did not stop. That was the thing she could not get used to. Every few mornings, just past first light, Scout would lift his head, ears up, nose working the air, and Tessa would know before she even looked. Something would be waiting on the flat gray stone. A twist of dried fruit. A small clutch of eggs nested in moss. Once a folded square of waxed cloth holding honey, dark and wild and sweet enough to make her eyes sting. Always set down with that same strange care. Always placed in the one spot a girl in that cave would be sure to find it, and always left while she slept, by hands she never saw. She told herself she should be afraid. A wiser girl would have moved on, found a new hollow, put miles of rock between herself and whoever it was that watched her in the dark. But she was learning something out here, in the green and breathing quiet. She was learning that fear and gratitude can live in the very same heart, at the very same time. And little by little, the gratitude was winning. And Scout was thriving. His ribs had filled out. His coat had gone thick and glossy in the clean mountain air. He moved through the trees now with a kind of joy she had not seen in him behind the tall white walls. He chased the little brown birds. He dug after things that weren't there. He came bounding back to her every time, tongue lolling, eyes bright, as if to say, "Can you believe this place? Can you believe we get to be here?" Watching him, Tessa would feel her chest go tight and warm all at once, because she had run for him, and out here, he was finally, simply happy. Still, there were the long evenings, when the fire had burned down to embers, and Scout lay dreaming with his paws twitching, and the stars came out cold and uncountable overhead. That was when the loneliness would find her. It was a quiet kind of ache. Not sharp, just deep. The ache of having no one in all the wide world to say goodnight to. No voice but her own. No face that knew her name. She had spent her whole life surrounded by other children, and somehow she had never been lonelier than she had been in that crowded house. Out here, alone, the loneliness was at least honest. But honest did not make it lighter. And on those long nights, she would find her thoughts circling back again and again to the same impossible question, the one the gifts had planted in her and watered and would not let her forget. Someone was out there, someone who fed her and asked for nothing, someone who, for reasons she could not begin to name, had decided that a thrown-away girl was worth keeping alive. She wanted to know who. She needed to know who. And one gray morning, she decided that she would find out. She rose before the light that day. She left Scout sleeping in the warm hollow of the bed, one hand pressed gently to his side so he wouldn't follow, and she crept out to the flat gray stone. And she waited. The cold seeped up through the rock and into her bones. The mist hung low and silver. She pulled the thin blanket tight around her shoulders and made herself as small and as still as she had ever been in all her years of practice. She waited a long time. And then, there, a sound, so soft she might have dreamed it. The faint crunch of a careful footstep, somewhere off among the trees below. The whisper of a body moving through the ferns, slow and patient, and trying very hard not to be heard. Tessa's heart climbed into her throat. She did not move. She barely breathed. Through the gap in the ivy, she watched the gray dawn, and after a moment, a shape came into it. Not Crane, not a sharp-eyed man with ropes and orders. An old man, bent and slow, and wrapped in a coat the color of bark. He moved with the stiff care of someone whose joints had long since stopped forgiving him. In one gnarled hand he carried a small bundle, wrapped in oilcloth, tied off with twine. He came as far as the edge of the clearing. He set the bundle down on the flat gray stone, gentle as you'd lay down a sleeping child. And then he straightened and stood there a moment, looking toward the dark mouth of the cave. And Tessa stepped out into the light. The old man froze. For one long breath, Neither of them moved. He was older than she had guessed. His face was a roadmap of deep, weathered lines, and his eyes, pale and startled, and a faded kind of blue, went wide at the sight of her. She had thought, in all her imagining, that she would feel afraid. She didn't. She felt the way you feel when a thing you have wondered about for so long is suddenly, simply, standing in front of you. "It was you," she said. Her voice came out rough from days of disuse, barely more than a whisper. "All of it. It was you." The old man's jaw worked. He looked for a moment like he might turn and flee back into the trees, the way a wild thing bolts when it's been seen. But he didn't. He stood his ground, that bent old man, and something in his weathered face seemed to crumble and settle all at once. "Figured you'd come looking, sooner or later," he said. His voice was rusty, low, like a door on a hinge that hadn't turned in years. "You've got that look about you, this kind that needs to know." He glanced down at the bundle on the stone, then back up at her. "Name's Walt," he said, and just like that, after all those silent days, Tessa was no longer alone in the ravine. He did not invite her to follow him. He simply turned and started off through the trees, slow and stiff. And somehow she understood that the following was up to her. So she went back and woke Scout, and the two of them trailed the old man through the green folds of the ravine. He led them along paths she had never found, down through a stand of pines where the light fell soft and golden, across a shallow run of clear water she hadn't known was there, up a gentle rise, and around a shoulder of mossy rock, to a small cabin, tucked back against the slope, near hidden beneath a tangle of climbing green. It was old, crooked, patched 100 times by hands that knew how. A thin thread of smoke rose from a stone chimney, and the smell of it, wood smoke and pine, and something simmering, reached out and wrapped around her like an arm. It was the first thing in days that had smelled like a home. Walt pushed open the door and held it. "Well," he said gruffly, not quite meeting her eyes, "you're letting the worm out." And Tessa, after 18 years of being told where she did and did not belong, stepped through a stranger's door because he'd asked her to. Inside, it was warm and close and lived in. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters. A worn chair sat by the fire. The walls were lined with the small, careful clutter of a man who had spent a long time alone and had learned to make his own company. Walt set a battered kettle over the flame. He moved around the small space with the slow sureness of someone who knew it in the dark. He cut a heel of bread and a wedge of hard cheese and set them in front of her without a word, as if it were the plainest thing in the world. Scout settled by the hearth at once, sighing into the warmth, and for a while neither of them spoke. There is a kind of quiet that two careful people share when they are each deciding how much to trust the other. It is not an empty quiet. It is a full one, a weighing. It was Tessa who broke it. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why feed me? You didn't know me. You still don't." Walt was quiet a long moment, staring into the fire. "Saw you come over the ridge," he said at last. "Saw the dog on your back. Saw the way you held on to him." He shook his head slowly. A girl doesn't carry a dog up a cliff in the dark unless she's running from something a good deal worse than the climb. He looked at her then. Really looked. I know what folks down there run from, he said, and I know what they run from him. The fire popped, and Tessa felt the small, cold weight of that name settle into the warm room. You know Crane, she said. It was not a question. The old man's face went hard and gray. I know him, Walt said. Better than I'd like. He didn't tell her the whole of it that first day. A man like Walt, who'd kept his own counsel for so long, does not pour himself out all at once. He gives a little, then he watches to see what you do with it. But over the days that followed, and she came back day after day, drawn to the warmth and the company and the simple miracle of a voice that wasn't her own. The old man's story came out, piece by careful piece. And the more of it she heard, the more the ground shifted beneath her. It came out slowly, the way deep things do. One evening, with the rain whispering on the roof and Scout asleep at her feet, Tessa said the thing that had been pressing on her since the very first morning she'd looked down into the green. They told us this place was poison, she said. All my life, bad air, bad water. They said anyone who went down here didn't come back. She looked at the old man across the fire. But you've lived here for years, and the water's the sweetest I've ever drunk. And the air. She trailed off. Walt didn't answer right away. He set down the bit of carving he'd been whittling. He folded his old hands together, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone very low and very tired. It ain't poison, he said. Never was. Tessa went still. The water in this ravine, Walt went on, is the cleanest for miles in any direction. Comes up out of the rock pure as anything was ever made. There's no bad air, no curse, no reason on this earth a soul couldn't live down here and live well. He stared into the flames. It's a lie, he said. The whole of it. A lie somebody made up. And a lie somebody else was too much of a coward to put right. His hand, she noticed, had begun to tremble. That somebody, the old man said quietly, would be me. The room seemed to go very still around them. Tessa didn't speak. She had learned long ago that the surest way to make a frightened thing talk is to stay quiet and let it. And so the old man talked. He told her there had been a time long before when he was younger and stronger and not yet bent, when he had known these hills better than any man alive. He had walked this ravine in every season. He had drunk its water and slept under its pines and known down in his bones that it was a good place, a living place. And then, he said, there had come a season of trouble, a slide of rock and mud up at the head of the spring that had muddied the water for a time. Folks downstream had taken sick from something or other, the kind of sickness that passes if you wait it out and tend the weak and keep your head. But August Crane had not let it pass. Crane had seen, in that small spell of bad luck, a thing he could use. He told the town the ravine was cursed, Walt said, his voice gone bitter as old smoke. Said the water had turned. Said the air was foul. Said any soul who went down would sicken and die. He shook his head slowly, and folks believed him. They were scared and grieving, And a frightened person'll believe most anything that lets them feel safe, with the place forbidden, with everyone too scared to set foot down here. Crane quietly bought up every scrap of land around it, for pennies, for nothing. Folks were glad to be rid of cursed ground. Walt's hands had curled into fists in his lap. "And I knew," he said. "I knew the whole of it was a lie. I had the truth, plain as the nose on my face. One word from me, and it might have come apart." He looked up at her then, and in his pale old eyes she saw a grief so deep and so old it had worn grooves in him. "I said nothing," Walt whispered. "I was afraid of him. So I came up here, and I hid, and I let the lie stand. For years, I told myself it was none of my business. I told myself it was too late." His voice cracked. "A man can tell himself a great many things to keep from looking at what he's become." Tessa sat with that for a long while. She thought of the house on the hill, of the cold cane on the polished floor, of all the children, herself among them, taught to be small and quiet and afraid. And now she understood something she hadn't before. The fear that ruled the house and the lie that ruled the ravine were the same fear, the same lie, cut from the very same cloth. August Crane did not rule with his fists. He ruled with fear, and with silence, and with the slow, patient certainty that no one would ever dare to speak. "You're not a coward," she said quietly. Walt let out a short, broken laugh. "Girl, you don't know the first thing about—" "You fed me," Tessa said. "A stranger, a girl who'd run from him. You knew what he'd do if he found out you'd helped one of his runaways. And you did it anyway." She held the old man's eyes. "That's not what a coward does," she said. Walt looked at her for a long, long moment, and something in his weathered face, something that had been clenched shut for a very long time, eased just a little. "First kind thing anybody's said to me in years," he muttered. He looked away into the fire, his eyes suspiciously bright. "And it had to be a half-starved girl who said it?" Tessa smiled. It surprised them both. But the world below had not forgotten her. She learned that on a gray afternoon, not long after, when the warmth had begun to feel almost safe. She had wandered farther than usual that day, down toward the lower run of the ravine, Scout ranging ahead of her through the ferns. The light was thin. The air was still. And then Scout stopped. He went rigid. His ears pinned back. A low warning sound rose in his chest. Tessa froze. And through the green, not 30 feet off, she saw him. A man. Not Walt. This one was younger, broad through the shoulders, dressed in the plain, hard clothes of a man who worked for his bread. He had stopped at the same instant she had. He stood very still among the ferns, and he was looking right at her. Her blood ran cold, because she knew, the way you know weather, who a man like that worked for. He had Crane's stamp on him, the look of a man sent up the mountain on another man's errand. She had been found. For a long, terrible moment, neither of them moved. Tessa's mind raced through every choice and found them all wanting. Run. He was bigger, faster. Fight? With what? Scream? Who would hear? Scout's growl deepened. The dog moved in front of her, low and bristling, every line of his small body saying the same thing. Not her. You don't get to take her. And the man slowly raised both his open hands. Easy, he said. His voice was low. Careful. The voice you'd use on a spooked horse or a frightened child. Easy now. I'm not going to hurt you. Tessa didn't move. Her knuckles had gone white where she gripped a fallen branch. She said nothing. Her silence was a wall. The man's eyes moved over her. The dirt on her face, the thinness of her frame, the dog standing guard at her feet. And something in his own face changed. The hard set of it loosened. A flicker of something crossed his eyes. Something old. Something that looked, to her, a great deal like pain. You're one of his, he said quietly. From the house, aren't you? It wasn't a question, and there was no triumph in it. Only a kind of weariness, so deep it seemed to come from the bottom of him. Tessa's grip tightened on the branch. This was the moment, she knew. He would call out. Others would come. The ropes, the orders, the long, cold walk back down the hill. She braced for it. It didn't come. The man looked at her dog. He looked at the way Scout stood between her and the world, trembling, ready to give everything he had to give for a girl who'd once gone hungry to feed him. And whatever the man saw in that, it undid him. His hands came down slowly. His shoulders dropped. He let out a long, slow breath, like a man setting down a weight he'd carried a long way. I had a girl once, he said. The words came quiet, almost to himself. And a dog that watched over her, just like that. He nodded at Scout, and his voice went rough. Lost them both. A bad season. Bad water down in the Lowtown. His jaw tightened. A powerful man who didn't trouble himself to care. He looked at Tessa, and in his eyes she saw it now, plain as day. The same grief she carried. The same wound Crane left on everyone he touched. Name's Daniel, he said, and whatever I'm being paid to do up here. He shook his head slowly. I find I haven't got the stomach for it today. He took a step back, then another. I never saw you, Daniel said. There's no girl in this ravine, no dog, nothing up here but rock and trees and bad air. The ghost of something crossed his face, not quite a smile. That's the story, and I'll be telling it for as long as it needs telling. He turned to go. Then he stopped. He unslung a small satchel from his shoulder, crouched, and set it down gently in the ferns. Dogs favoring his back leg, Daniel said, not looking at her. There's salve in there, and something for fever, should it come to that. Up here, it's good to have it on hand. And then he was gone, swallowed by the green, the way he'd come. Tessa stood frozen long after the ferns had stilled. Her heart was slamming. The branch was still clenched in her white-knuckled hand, and slowly, she understood what had just happened. Twice now, the world had reached out to her in this forbidden place. Twice, kindness had come from exactly where she'd been taught to expect a blow, an old man's gift on a cold stone. A hard man's mercy in the ferns. two souls, each carrying their own wound from the same cruel hand, and each choosing, when it counted, to be gentle. She knelt and opened the satchel. Salve, just as he'd said, and a small packet of fever herbs. He'd seen the limp she hadn't even noticed. He'd thought ahead to a sickness that hadn't come. He had seen more than she'd realized. She gathered Scout close and pressed her face into his fur. And she let herself shake, just for a moment, with everything she'd been holding. The world was not what she'd been told. The forbidden place was not poison. The cruel man's people were not all cruel. And a girl who'd been taught she was worth nothing was being kept alive, again and again, by the kindness of strangers. It was almost too much to hold. But the ravine was not done with her yet. It had one more secret, and she was about to walk straight into it. It happened a few days later. She had taken to exploring, now that the fear had loosened its grip. With Walt's blessing and Scout at her heels, she ranged farther each day into the deep green folds of the place, learning its hidden corners, its old paths, its quiet bones. And on one of those days, following a thread of clear water upstream, she pushed through a heavy curtain of hanging vines and stopped dead. Scout stopped beside her. For a long moment, Tessa simply stood and stared and could not make sense of what her own eyes were telling her. Because there, in a sheltered hollow, deep in the heart of the forbidden ravine, in a place no one was supposed to be able to live, stood a house. It was old, older than Walt's cabin, half swallowed by the green, its roof gone soft with moss, its windows dark and empty. Vines had climbed its walls and pulled at its corners, patient as years. The forest had been working a long, slow time to take it back. But it had been a real house once, a home. And around it, that was the thing that stole the breath clean out of her. Around it lay a garden, gone wild now, gone to seed and tangle, but unmistakable. Rows that had once been straight, beds that had once been tended. Stubborn flowers still pushing up, year after year, through the choking weeds, blooming for no one at all, refusing to forget that someone had once planted them with care. Tessa walked into that wild garden as if she were walking into a dream. She touched the rough wood of the doorframe. She ran her hand along a windowsill where someone, long ago, had set a row of small stones in a careful little line. Someone had lived here. Someone had built a home and planted a garden and made a life. In the very place the whole town swore would kill them. The lie shattered around her, complete and final. Not bad air, not poison, not a curse. A home that someone had loved, and someone else had worked very hard to make the whole world forget. Scout barked once, sharp and bright, and went bounding off through the long grass after some scent only he could find. But Tessa stood very still in the heart of that ruined garden, her hand pressed flat against the old gray wood, and felt something rise up inside her that she had no name for. Not fear, not even hope, exactly. Something more like a question. A door swinging slowly open onto a darkness she suddenly, fiercely, needed to see into. Who had lived here? Who had planted these flowers and set these little stones and made a home in a place that everyone had been taught to fear. And what had happened to them? That the house stood empty, and the garden ran wild, and a powerful man down in the town had spent so many years making certain that no living soul would ever come up here to find it. She did not know. Not yet. But she could feel it now, the way you feel a storm before it breaks. That the answer was close, that it was waiting for her, somewhere inside those dark and empty walls, and that when she finally found it, nothing in her world, or in the world of the cruel man on the hill, would ever stand quite the same way again. The sky had been wrong since morning, heavy, low, a bruised and waiting gray that pressed down on the whole green valley and stole the song clean out of the birds. Tessa felt it before she understood it, a tightness behind her ribs, a held breath she couldn't seem to let go of, and Scout felt it too. He stayed glued to her heels through the long, uneasy afternoon, his ears flat, his tail tucked low, looking up at her again and again as if to ask whether she had seen it coming the way he had. By dusk, the air had gone thick and still, the kind of still that isn't peace, the kind that comes right before something breaks. And then, just past dark, it broke. It did not come gently. It came down out of the high country like something with a grievance against the living world. Not rain so much as a wall of water, flung sideways on a wind that screamed through the ravine and bent the old pines double over their own roots. Thunder cracked so close it seemed to split the rock. And in the white flash that followed, the whole green world stood frozen for half a heartbeat, drowned and wild and made strange. The familiar slopes turned to running silver. The gentle paths turned to rivers. The place that had become her sanctuary turned, in a single night, into something that did not know her at all. Tessa pulled Scout deep into the cave and wrapped the thin blanket around them both, tight as she could. But the cave that had kept them dry through softer nights had no answer for a night like this one. Water found its way in through a dozen unseen cracks. It ran down the stone walls in cold ribbons. It pooled across the floor and crept into their bed of branches until the whole of it was a sodden, freezing ruin. The wind reached its long fingers in through the curtain of ivy and tore at what little warmth they had left, and the cold came in behind the water, slow and patient and merciless, like a hand closing around the two of them in the dark. Tessa held the shivering dog against her chest and pressed her lips to the top of his head and whispered to him through the roar. "It'll pass," she told him. "Storms always pass. We hold on till morning. That's all we have to do. Just hold on till morning." She wasn't sure she believed it, but she said it anyway, because sometimes saying a brave thing out loud is as close as a frightened person can come to being brave. So she said it over and over all through that long and roaring night. Hold on, hold on, hold on. By the gray and ruined light of dawn, the worst of it had blown through, but the damage was done. The ravine looked wounded, great branches torn down and flung across the slopes. The little paths she had come to know in her bones washed clean off the face of the mountain. The air hung heavy with the smell of broken pine and turned black earth, and a thin, miserable drizzle still sifted down out of the low clouds. And Scout was sick. She knew it the moment she truly felt him. He had stopped shivering somewhere in the night, and in her exhaustion she had taken that for a mercy, until she understood, with a lurch of cold dread, that it was no mercy at all. He lay too still against her. His breathing had gone shallow and quick, a rapid little flutter she could feel under her hand. When she touched his nose, it was hot and dry, and when she coaxed him, soft and desperate, to stand, his legs trembled beneath him and folded, and he sank back down with a low sound that broke her heart clean in two. He looked up at her. His eyes, that had gone so bright out here in the clean mountain air, were dull now, and clouded, and confused. And something in Tessa's chest cracked straight down the middle. She had faced the hunger. She had faced the cold. She had faced the long, hollow loneliness, and the fear of the man on the hill, and the sheer, wild strangeness of learning to live off the bones of the land. This was something else. This was the very fear she had run from in the first place, come back to find her, wearing a crueler face, not a man with a silver cane, taking her dog away. The world itself, now, reaching out to do the taking. She did not let herself fall apart. There would be time for that later, if it came to that. There was none for it now. Daniel's satchel, the fever herbs. Her hands shook so hard she nearly spilled them. The small packet the hard-eyed man had pressed on her in the ferns, thinking ahead to a sickness that had now walked right through the door. She crushed the leaves the way Walt had shown her, mixed them with what clean water she could gather, and gently, so gently, she worked the bitter mixture between Scout's jaws, a little at a time, murmuring to him without pause. He coughed. He fought it. His throat worked, but he swallowed. It was something. It was not enough, because the cave was finished. She understood that, looking around at the streaming walls and the freezing pools gathering on the floor. To stay here, in the wet and the killing cold, would be to sit and watch him slip away from her by inches. She had to get him dry. She had to get him warm. And in that desperate moment, with the rain still falling and her dog burning up in her arms, her mind went to the old house, the home in the heart of the valley. Adeline's house, though she didn't yet know its name. Deep and sheltered, with thick old walls that had stood against 100 storms worse than this one. It was a long way off. The paths were gone. The slopes would be a nightmare of sliding mud and treacherous stone. But it was the one warm place she could think of, and so she would carry him to it, or she would die trying. There was no third thing. She wrapped Scout in the blanket, and then in her own coat over that, until he was a small bundled weight against her chest. She settled him into the canvas bag the way she had carried him up the cliff on that first wild night, an age ago, his weak head lolling against her shoulder. She tightened the straps, and she stepped out into the wounded world. The climb was a thing out of a nightmare. The rock ran slick with rain and moss, every handhold a gamble against the cold stone. The mud sucked at her boots and dragged at her legs, trying with every step to pull her back down into the drowned ravine. Wet branches clawed at her face and snagged at the bag. The cold had settled so deep into her bones that her hands had gone clumsy and far away, and her arms screamed under the weight of the dog, and still she climbed, and slipped, and climbed again. Twice her footing went clean out from under her. The first time she caught a root, and hung there gasping, the whole gray drowned valley swimming below her, her heart slamming in her throat. The second time was worse. She went down hard on one knee, and a shower of loose stone broke away beneath her and went clattering off into the gray, and for one long and terrible moment she felt herself begin to slide, with Scout helpless and burning on her back, toward the dark lip of the slope. She dug in. She dug in with her bleeding fingers and her screaming arms, and every last stubborn thing inside her that had refused, through all those gray and silent years, to finally go out. And she did not let go. Not like this, she gritted out to the storm, to the mountain, to whatever cold and listening thing might be out there in the gray. You don't get to take him. Do you hear me? Not like this. Not after everything. Not after how far we've come. She found her feet. She set her jaw. And she kept on climbing. She could not afterward have said how long it took. There was no time in it. There was only the next handhold, and the next slick rock, and the warm weight against her chest, and the thin, ragged sound of Scout's breathing close against her ear, the one sound in the whole drowned world that mattered to her at all. Each breath was a small promise. He's still here. He's still here. He's still here. And then, just as the last of her strength was running out of her like water through cupped fingers, the curtain of hanging vines, the old house, she half fell through the green and stumbled across the worn stone threshold, and the storm fell away behind her, shut out at last by walls that had stood a long, long time against far worse than this. It was dim inside, and thick with dust, and empty as a held breath. But it was dry, and it was still. Tessa sank to her knees on the old wooden floor, and with the very last of her care, she lowered Scout out of the bag, and she knelt over him in the gray gloom of that long abandoned home. And finally, she let herself shake. "We made it," she whispered into his fur. Her voice cracked and shook. "We made it. You hear me? Now you hold on. You hold on for me. We didn't come all this way for you to let go now." She made him a bed in the driest corner, away from the windows where the wind still moaned through the broken panes. A soft nest of her coat and the damp blanket, the best she could manage. She had no fire yet, no strength left to make one, but the thick old walls held what little warmth there was and gave it back, the way good walls do. She tucked the dog in close. She dribbled more of the bitter medicine between his jaws. And then she did the one thing left in all the world for her to do. She waited. She sat with her back against the old wall and gathered the sick dog into her lap, and she kept her hand flat against his side so she could feel each breath rise and fall. She talked to him through the long gray hours in a low and steady stream, the way you talk to keep someone tethered to the world. She told him about the wild garden outside, gone to seed and waiting. She told him about Walt's warm cabin and the herbs hanging from the rafters. She told him every small good thing she could lay her tongue to, as if the future itself were a rope she might throw out to him, hand over hand, and haul him back from the dark with. "You're going to chase butterflies again," she told him softly. "You're going to dig holes and roll in the grass and drive me half out of my mind. You just have to stay. That's all. Just stay." And as the slow hours passed and the light shifted gray and patient across the dusty floor, her tired eyes began to wander. It was a real home, this place. She could see that now, in the thin daylight. Not grand, far from it, but it had been loved once. There was a hearth in the wall, the stone gone cold a long age ago. A heavy table, thick with the dust of years. A single chair drawn up to the window, where someone must once have sat in the evenings to watch the green light fade out of the valley. And in the far corner, half buried beneath a fallen shelf, and a soft drift of dead leaves blown in through the broken pane, a small wooden box. Tessa noticed it the way you finally notice a thing your eye has slid past a dozen times before. She eased Scout from her lap, settling him gently in the warm nest of cloth so he would not wake. And she crossed the creaking floor, and she knelt, and she lifted the box out from under the quiet wreckage of all those passing years. It was carved by hand, worn smooth along its edges from much handling, long ago. A small clasp held the lid shut, gone green and stubborn with age. Her fingers hovered over it. Some part of her knew, even then, the way a person knows before they open a door that the room beyond is going to change them. That whatever lay sleeping inside this little box had been waiting here, in the dark and the dust, for someone to climb all this way and find it. She worked the clasp. She lifted the lid. Inside lay the small, saved treasures of a life. A bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, the paper gone soft and yellow and brittle with time. A single pressed flower, faded to a ghost of brown lace. And a photograph. Tessa lifted it careful as a bird's egg into the gray light from the window. It showed a woman, not young, not old. A strong, plain, open face, with kind eyes and laugh lines worn deep at the corners of her mouth. She stood in a doorway. This doorway, Tessa realized with a chill, the very one, and around her, pressed close against her skirts, leaning into her the way flowers lean toward the sun, were children, a whole gathering of them, small ones and big ones, ragged ones and patched ones, children with the very same look Tessa had seen staring back at her from every mirror her whole life long. The unmistakable look of having been set aside, thrown away, left behind by a world that hadn't wanted them. But there was something different in these children's faces, something she had to look at twice to understand. They were smiling, not the careful, downcast, frightened smiles she knew from the house on the hill. Real ones. Wide and easy and unguarded. The smiles of children who knew, all the way down in their small bones, that the woman in the doorway was glad, truly glad, that they were there. Tessa stared at that photograph for a long, long time. Her throat had gone tight, and then, with hands not quite steady, she untied the faded ribbon, and she began to read. The letters were written in a warm and looping hand, the hand of a woman whose name was signed at the bottom of each one, in that same generous, unhurried script. Adeline. They were not grand letters. They held no great speeches, no fine words. They spoke of small things, plain things, the turning of the weather, a child's first laugh, a row of beans coming up green, a roof that wanted mending before the cold came on, the ordinary daily bread of an ordinary, extraordinary life, but running through every single one of them, like a thread of pure gold worked through plain gray cloth. There ran one bright and unbroken idea, a dream. The woman called Adeline had a dream, and she had set it down again and again in her letters, the way a person returns to touch the thing they love most. She wrote of a place, a real home, she called it, underlined in one letter with a firm and certain stroke, a real home for the children that the world had thrown away. Not a place of rules and locked doors and cold accountings. A place of warmth. A place where a child who had been told they were worth nothing might be told instead, every single morning, that they were worth keeping. She wrote of building it. With her own 2 hands she wrote, if that was what it took. And she wrote of a green and hidden valley she had found, a place of clean, sweet water and good dark earth, tucked away from cruel and grasping eyes, where she meant to plant her garden and raise her children and make it last the kind of home she had ached for as a small and lonely girl herself. Tessa's breath caught hard in her chest. A green and hidden valley, clean, sweet water, and good dark earth. She lowered the letter slowly. She looked up at the old loved walls around her, at the wild and waiting garden beyond the broken window, at the ruined, sheltering home that someone had built with their own 2 hands, in the very place the whole world swore would surely kill them. And she understood. The truth came over her all at once, like cold water, like the breaking of a dawn. This was Adeline's house. This valley, this forbidden, poisoned, fearful, whispered about place, was the home a kind woman had dreamed of, and found, and built. A sanctuary for thrown-away children. A green garden raised up against the cruelty of the world. And then, somehow, it had ended. The house stood empty now. The garden ran to wild tangle. And down below in the town, behind clean white walls, the very children Adeline had dreamed of saving were being taught instead to be small and silent and afraid. Taught by a man with a silver cane and a book full of careful numbers. A man who had taken her dream and gone and turned it cold. Tessa sat very still in the dust and the slanting gray light, the brittle letters trembling in her hands, and the last scattered pieces of it fell into place with a quiet and terrible click. Of course, Crane had called this valley forbidden. Of course he had spread the lie of poison and bad air and curses on the ground. Of course he had worked so long and so patiently to make certain that no living soul would ever dare to climb up here and see it for themselves. Because up here was the truth. Up here was the living proof that the home on the hill had been born out of love and not out of cruelty. That it was meant to be a sanctuary and never a prison. That a kind woman named Adeline had dreamed the whole of it into being with her own bare hands, and that a cold man named Crane had come along after and stolen it and twisted it past recognizing, and spent years working to scrub her memory off the face of the earth. This empty, sheltering house was the one thing in the world he feared. And Tessa had just carried her dying dog straight into the heart of it. A sound pulled her back. A small sound, the very softest thing. Scout. She was across the room and at his side in a single breath, the letters forgotten on the dusty floor behind her. He had stirred. His eyes had cracked open, and they were clearer now. Just a little. Just enough. He found her face, and his tail lifted, and gave one weak and hopeful thump against the old wooden boards. She pressed her trembling hand to his nose. Cooler. Not cool, but cooler than the burning dry of the morning. The fever was turning. "There you are," she breathed, and her voice broke clean apart on it. "There you are. I knew it. I knew you'd hold on for me. I knew it." She gathered him up against her chest and held him, and rocked him, and the wild flood of relief washed through her so hard and so sudden that it left her dizzy and weeping all at once. And outside, as if the whole world had only been waiting for the small, brave dog to turn the corner toward living, the rain finally stopped. A thin shaft of pale gold broke through the heavy clouds and came slanting in through the broken window and fell across the dusty floor, across the scattered letters of a long-gone woman, across a girl and her dog, the two of them battered and soaked and alive, both of them holding on. 2 storms had broken over that house in a single night, and both of them, in the end, had passed. Walt found them not long after. He came struggling up through the wreckage of the slopes, leaning hard on his old stick, his weathered face creased deep with worry, and the relief that broke across it when he saw her safe was a thing she would carry with her for a long while after. "Fool girl," he said roughly, which from Walt was a kind of love. "Climbed up to that cave of yours soon as the worst passed. Found it flooded clean out and you gone. Thought I'd lost you in the night." He looked down at the bundle in her arms, at the dog breathing steady there. "He pull through then?" "He pulled through," Tessa said softly. The old man nodded, slow and heavy with feeling, and then his pale eyes moved past her, into the dim old house, and they changed. He went very still. He looked around at the cold, dead hearth, at the dusty table, at the chair drawn up to the window. He looked at the scattered letters on the floor, and the open carved box, and the photograph lying there, face up, in the long shaft of pale gold light. And the old man's face, that weathered, careful, long-shuttered face that had hidden so much for so long, crumpled like paper in a fist. "You found it," he whispered, the words barely held together. "After all these years, you found her." He sank down heavily into the dusty chair by the window, like a man whose legs had finally given out beneath a weight he had carried too far, for far too long, and the last of the story came pouring out of him. He had known her, Adeline, long ago when he was younger and stronger, and the whole valley was green and alive with the sound of children. He had helped her in those days, hauled lumber on his back, mended the very roof over their heads, turned and dug the garden beds that ran wild and forgotten now, just beyond the broken window. She was the best of all of us. Walt said. His voice had gone low and rough as gravel. Took in the little ones nobody else would have. Loved them like they were her own blood. Built this whole place up out of nothing but stubbornness and kindness and her own 2 hands. He shook his bowed head slowly. She had a dream, that woman. A true home for throwaway children. And by all that's good, she was building it. Stone by stone, she was building it. What happened to her? Tessa asked, though some quiet part of her already knew the shape of the answer. The old man's jaw worked hard. Crane happened, he said, and the name fell into the warm, dim room like a stone dropped into still water, sending its cold rings out to every corner. He came along after she was gone, Walt went on, his voice gone bitter as wood smoke. Got his hands on the home she'd started down in the town, turned it into the cold and counting place it is today. And this valley, her dream, her whole heart. He couldn't abide folks remembering it. Couldn't risk a single soul climbing up here and finding the proof that the home was ever meant to be a warm and loving thing. He looked up at her, and his pale old eyes were wet and shining. So he poisoned it, Walt said. Not the water. The water's clean as it ever was. He poisoned the story. Made the whole frightened town believe this place would kill them dead. Buried her and everything she ever dreamed of under a lie a mile deep. He looked down at his old, gnarled, shaking hands. And I let him do it, the old man whispered. I knew the truth of every last bit of it. And I was too afraid of him to say one single word. So I crawled up here, and I hid in my cabin. And I let her good memory rot away in the dark for 30 years. His voice cracked clean through the middle. Best soul I ever knew in all my life. And I stood by, and I let the whole world forget she ever drew a living breath. The old house was quiet for a long, long while. The pale gold light moved slow across the floor. Scout breathed easy now, steady and deep in the warm cradle of Tessa's lap. And the girl sat there among the scattered letters of a woman she had never once met in life, and felt something rise up inside her that was bigger than fear, and older than grief, and far stronger than anything the house on the hill had ever managed to beat or starve out of her. It was not only anger, though there was a clean, white anger in it. It was not only sorrow, though there was sorrow enough to fill the valley. It was something more like purpose, a reason, the kind a person can build a whole life on top of. She looked down at the photograph in her hand, at Adeline's kind and steady eyes, at the children pressed close against her skirts, wearing those real, unafraid, wide-open smiles. Children just exactly like her. A home just exactly like the one she had dreamed of, lying awake on a cold floor through all those long gray nights, listening to a small dog breathe on the other side of a wooden wall. It had been real once. Someone had built it. Someone had loved them fiercely and on purpose. And a cold and careful man had stolen it and lied about it and counted all his life on the simple fact that no one left alive would ever be brave enough to take it back from him. He thinks no one will ever know, Tessa said quietly. Walt lifted his head and looked at her. He's spent his whole life making sure of it, she went on. and her voice was steady now, low and sure, and certain as bedrock. The lie about this place, the fear in that house, the way he keeps every soul down there small and quiet. It all rests on one single thing. She looked up. That nobody's brave enough to speak. That nobody will ever stand up in front of him and say, I know the truth, and I'm not afraid of you anymore. She rose to her feet, the photograph held careful in one hand, the warm dog cradled in the crook of the other arm. Well, she said softly, somebody knows now. Walt stared up at her, and the fear came into his old face. Girl, he said slowly, you can't mean to go down there, to stand in front of him. He'll what? Tessa said. Send me back to the home? Take my dog away from me? A small, fierce smile touched the corner of her mouth. He already tried both of those, Walt. That's exactly how I ended up here. That's how I found her. Everything he did to break me. It's the very thing that brought me to the truth. She knelt and gently laid Scout back down in his warm nest of cloth, and she gathered the brittle letters back into the carved box. The photograph laid careful on top, soft as you'd tuck in a sleeping child. All those little ones down there, she said, being taught every single day that they're worth nothing, being made small and quiet and afraid. The same exact way I was, my whole life. She closed the lid of the box. They deserve to know the truth of it. They deserve to know that someone once dreamed up a real home for them, that it wasn't a fairy story, that it was real, and that it can be real again. She looked at the old man. I'm not asking you to fight him for me, Walt. You've carried this stone long enough for one lifetime. Her voice gentled. But I'd be glad of you standing behind me, if you can find it in yourself. That's all. For a long moment, the old man said nothing at all. And then, slowly, stiffly, like something old and rusted finally turning over after years of standing still, he pushed himself up out of the chair and onto his feet. 30 years, he said thickly. 30 years I've been a coward in this valley. He drew himself up as straight and as tall as his bent old back would allow. I reckon it's about high time I tried my hand at being something else. Daniel came at dusk. He'd climbed up to look in on her after the storm, he said gruffly, the way a hard man explains away a soft thing he's embarrassed to be caught doing. He carried a heavy pack of food and more medicine besides, and the plain relief on his weathered face when he found her safe and whole was its own quiet kind of confession. He listened in the gathering dark of Adeline's house, while Tessa told him everything she had found. He took the photograph in his big rough hands and looked at it for a long, long time. He looked at the kind woman and the smiling children, and his jaw tightened in that way she had come to know. I always knew the home wasn't the way it is now, he said at last, very quietly. Heard folks talk, the old ones. Said it used to be a warm place once, a long while back, before his time there. He shook his head slowly. Never knew the whole of it. Never once dreamed there was proof of it left anywhere in the world. He set the photograph down gentle as glass. He's calling a gathering, you know, Daniel said. Down in the town, just a few days off now. got the whole place stirred up and frightened over hard times coming, and he means to stand up there in front of every last one of them and play the great man, the one who'll set it all right. His mouth twisted. He does love a crowd, that one. Loves to be the man they all look up to. Loves to be needed. He paused, and his brow furrowed. There's more to it, too, he added slowly. He's had me drawing up a map this past month, the whole country round about. Every hill, every hollow, means to lay claim to the last of the land that isn't already his. The home, the fields. His eyes lifted to hers. And the wild country beyond the ridge. This valley. He's about to swallow it whole, to keep it locked away for good. Tessa went very still. A gathering, the whole town, all of them, in one room, and Crane, about to seal away the one place that held the truth, forever. And slowly, slowly, that fierce, small smile came creeping back to the corner of her mouth. Daniel, she said softly, when is it, exactly, this gathering of his? The plan came together that night, in the warm dark of Adeline's house, by the light of the first fire that old cold hearth had known in more years than anyone could count. It was a simple plan, and a terribly dangerous one. Tessa would go down off the mountain, into the town, into the very gathering where the whole frightened place would be packed in, close to hear the cruel man name himself their savior, and she would stand up, in front of all of them, the girl who had run off into the poisoned ravine and lived to tell of it. The girl who had climbed up to the truth he'd buried so deep and dug it back out into the light. And she would tell them, plainly, what she knew. Walt would stand with her, the keeper of the old days, ready at the very last to break 30 long years of frightened silence. Daniel would stand with her too, the man who had lost everything he loved to Crane's cold and careless hand, ready now to say so right out loud, where the whole town could hear it. But it was her story, her fight, her own 2 feet that would carry her down off that mountain and through the door of that crowded room. The old man and the hard man would stand behind her. She would stand out in front. That night, with the plan made and the fire burned down to a soft glow, Tessa sat in the open doorway of Adeline's house. Scout lay warm and healing and steady against her side, and she looked out at the dark shape of the wild garden, bathed in the cold and patient light of the stars. She thought about the woman who had raised these walls. She thought about the children in the photograph, with their real, unafraid, wide-open smiles. She thought about all the small ones still down there in that cold white house on the hill, learning the wrong lessons by candlelight in the dark. And she made the woman in the photograph a quiet promise. "They'll know about you," she whispered out into the night. "I'll see to it myself. They'll know you were real. They'll know your name. They'll know what it was you wanted for us, what you dreamed for children like me." Her hand found the warm fur at Scout's neck. "And I'm going to give it back to them. All of it." The night wind stirred through the wild garden and set the tall grass whispering, as if the place itself had heard her and was glad. The stars wheeled slow and bright overhead, and far down the mountain, in a clean and silent white house, A man with a silver cane slept soundly in his bed, certain, so very certain, that all his old secrets lay safe and buried in the dark where he had put them. He had no idea. He had no idea that high above him, in the Forbidden Valley, in a home he had worked half a lifetime to wipe from the memory of the world, a thrown-away girl was sitting up by the embers, lacing her worn boots tight, and that come the morning of his grand gathering, she would be coming down the mountain. She would not be coming alone, and she would be bringing the buried truth right down with her into the light for every frightened soul in that town to finally see. The morning of the gathering came up clear and cold. The storm had washed the world clean, and now the sky stretched wide and pale and blue above the valley, as if it too were holding its breath, waiting to see what the day would bring. Tessa stood in the doorway of Adeline's house and laced her worn boots tight. She had washed in the cold spring water. She had combed the tangles from her hair with her fingers, and from an old trunk in the corner, beneath a fall of dust and years, she had found a simple dress, soft gray wool, plain and clean, folded away by careful hands long ago. It fit her near enough. When she stood, she did not look like a wild thing out of a forbidden place. She did not look like a runaway, or a foundling, or a number waiting to be crossed off a page. She looked like a young woman who had made up her mind. She knelt beside Scout, who lay warm and drowsy in his nest of blankets by the low fire. He was mending, but slowly. The long fever had left him weak. The climb down the mountain, and whatever waited at the bottom of it, was no place for a half-healed dog. "You stay here," she whispered, smoothing his ears. "You rest. You're safe in her house. Nobody comes up here, remember? Nobody dares." She pressed her forehead to his. "I'll be back before dark. And when I come, everything's going to be different. You'll see." Scout thumped his tail once against the floor. He didn't understand the words, but he understood her. He always had. She tucked the carved wooden box under her arm, the letters, the photograph, the whole buried truth of the place, gathered up small enough to carry. Then she stepped out into the cold, bright morning and began the long walk down. Walt and Daniel were waiting where the slope met the lower trees. The old man had put on a clean shirt, gone soft and gray with washing. He stood straighter than she had seen him stand before, leaning on his stick more from habit than from need. There was a light in his pale eyes that had been a long time gone. Daniel stood beside him, broad and quiet, his hard face set. Neither of them said much. There wasn't much that needed saying. The three of them looked at one another in the cold morning light, at the foot of the forbidden mountain. And then they turned together and started down the last of the way toward the town. A girl, an old man, a hard man. 3 souls the cruel one on the hill had wounded, each in his own time, each in his own way, walking down out of the green to set it right. The town had gathered, just as Daniel had said it would. They came from every gravel lane and folded hill, filling the long meeting hall to its walls. Anxious faces, weary faces, lit by the warm yellow glow of lamps against the dim. The air was close and thick with the smell of wet wool and worry. and a low murmur ran through the crowd like wind through a wheat field. For at the front of the hall, beside a tall easel draped in cloth, stood August Crane. He was in his element. He stood the way a shepherd stands among his flock, calm and patient and certain of his place above them. His suit was pressed, his silver cane gleamed in the lamplight, and when he spoke, his voice rolled out over the frightened crowd like warm oil over cold water, soothing and smooth and sure. He spoke of hard times come upon the town. He spoke of trouble and want and the lean days ahead. He painted the picture dark and careful and complete. A worry that pressed in on every side. A worry that only a wise and steady hand could hope to lead them through. And then, his voice shifting from sorrow to something grander, he spread his hands wide. "But take heart," August Crane said, "for where there is trouble, there is also a man who has prepared." He nodded to his assistant, who drew the cloth away from the easel. Beneath it lay a map, the whole of the country round about, every hill and hollow drawn and bordered in a careful, slanting hand. "I mean to take the last of this land under my own care," Crane said, his voice warm with false kindness. "The home, the fields, the wild country beyond the ridge." His finger came to rest on a green and empty space at the very edge of the map. The ravine. All of it, held safe under one steady hand. Mine, if you'll grant it to me, for your protection, for the good of every soul in this room. And the crowd leaned in, hungry for hope, ready to be saved. "The doors are barred," said a clear voice from the back of the hall. Every head in the room turned at once. There, framed in the open doorway, the cold, bright morning light spilling in around her, stood a girl. She was clean and plain and steady. Her gray dress caught the light. Under one arm she held a small carved wooden box. And though she was young and slight, and stood entirely alone in that doorway, there was something in the set of her shoulders that made the whole crowded room go still. A murmur ran through them. Who is she? Whose girl is that? And then, from the front of the hall, August Crane's smooth voice cut through it. "Ah," he smiled his thin and bloodless smile. "A troubled girl. One of the children from the home. She's unwell, I'm afraid. Wandered off some days ago. Someone really ought to see her safely." "My name is Tessa," the girl said, and her voice, though quiet, carried to every corner of that silent hall. "I ran from your home," she said, looking straight at him, down the whole length of the crowded room. "Days ago, with my dog, because you meant to take him from me, because you said he was a thing not worth keeping." She took a step forward, into the lamplight. "And you told everyone I'd run off into a poisoned valley, a place that would surely kill me." She lifted her chin. "Well," she said, "here I am." A ripple went through the crowd. Crane's smile did not move, but something behind his pale eyes had gone cold and sharp. "As I said," he murmured, "unwell. The mountain plays tricks on a frightened mind. We mustn't—" "I lived up there," Tessa said, louder now. "For weeks. I drank the water. I ate from the land. And I am standing here, in front of all of you, alive and well. She turned slowly to take in the whole room, every anxious face. The valley is not poisoned. It never was. The water is the cleanest any of you has ever tasted, and the man at the front of this room has known that the whole time. The murmur swelled. Doubt was a small seed, and it had just been planted. "This is absurd," Crane said, and for the first time a thin edge crept into his smooth voice. "The ravings of a runaway child. I will not have this gathering disrupted by—" "She's not raving." The new voice came from the doorway, rough, old, and it shook, just slightly, with the weight of all the years behind it. Walt stepped into the hall, and a gasp went through the older folk in the crowd, for there were those among them who remembered the bent old man, who had thought him long dead or long gone, vanished into the hills an age ago. "I knew the truth of it," Walt said, his voice gathering strength as he came. "All these years, I knew the valley was clean. I knew the story he told you was a lie." He stopped and faced the crowd, and his old eyes were wet and burning. "And I was too afraid of that man to say a single word. For 30 years, I let him keep you frightened. For 30 years, I let a lie stand where the truth should have been." He drew a long, shaking breath. "I'm done being afraid," the old man said, "and I'm done being quiet." Crane's composure was cracking now. Anyone could see it. The smooth surface of him, the easy certainty, had begun to splinter at the edges. "This is a coordinated attack," he said, his voice rising. "A senile old hermit, a delinquent girl, some grudge, and me." Daniel stepped forward. The crowd knew him. He was one of their own. A man who'd done Crane's work, taken Crane's pay, kept his head down like the rest of them. And now he stood in the lamplight with his hard face set, and he looked the powerful man dead in the eye. "I worked for you," Daniel said quietly. "Did what I was told. Looked the other way plenty of times when I shouldn't have." His jaw tightened. "Found this girl up in that valley. Was supposed to bring her back to you." He shook his head slowly. "Couldn't do it. Looked at her and her dog, and I thought of my own girl, the one I lost, the one a powerful man couldn't be bothered to care about." His voice went low and rough. "I'm tired of looking the other way." The murmur in the hall had become a low, rising tide, and Tessa stepped to the very front of the room. She set the carved box down on the table beside the easel, in plain view of all of them, and she opened it. "You all built your fear on a lie," she said. "But this town was built on something else, something he made you forget." She lifted out the photograph and held it up high, so the lamplight fell across it. "This is a woman named Adeline," Tessa said. "Some of the old ones here might remember her. She started the home, the one on the hill, before him." A sharp breath went through the older folk, a name half remembered, a face from a long time ago. "She didn't build it to be a cold place," Tessa went on, and her voice trembled now with something fierce and bright. "She built it to be a home, a real one, for children that nobody wanted. She took them in and she loved them, and she told them every single day that they were worth keeping. She turned the photograph slowly so the whole hall could see. "Look at their faces," she said softly. "Look at how those children are smiling." And the room looked. "She had a dream," Tessa said. "She found a green valley with clean water and good earth, and she built a home there with her own 2 hands, a place far from cruel eyes, a sanctuary." She set the photograph down gently and lifted out the letters. "It's all here," she said, in her own hand. The home she dreamed of, the valley she loved. Her eyes lifted to Crane, and they did not waver. And then he came, and he took the home she'd started, and he turned it cold, and he couldn't have any of you remembering what it was meant to be. He couldn't risk you climbing up to that valley and finding the proof. The hall had gone utterly silent now. "So he buried her," Tessa said. "Not in the ground, in a lie. He told you her valley was poison, so that no one would ever go up there and learn the truth. He made you afraid of the one place that holds the proof of who you really are." She lifted her eyes to the map on the easel. "And now he means to lock it away forever, so none of you can ever go and see." She looked out at them, all those weary, anxious, listening faces. "He spent his whole life," she said, "betting that none of you would ever be brave enough to find out." For a long moment, no one in the hall breathed. And then they turned, as one, toward the front of the room, toward August Crane. He stood beside his map, his grand gesture, his careful plan, and for the first time in the memory of anyone present, the smooth and certain mask had fallen clean away from his face. What lay beneath it was not anger. It was fear, the hollow, scrambling fear of a man who has felt the ground shift beneath a thing he was sure would hold. "Lies," he said, but his voice had lost its oil. It came out thin and cracked. "Forgeries, a scrap of old paper, a faded picture. It proves nothing. Nothing." His pale eyes darted across the crowd, searching for the certainty he had always found there, and finding it, going. "It proves," Tessa said quietly, "that the truth is up in that valley. Right now, her house, her garden, the clean water, all of it, still there, waiting." And the crowd began to stir, to rumble, to rise, voices lifting, faces hardening, years of swallowed fear and quiet grievance, finding at last a single direction to flow. Someone called out, "Let's go see it. Let's go up and see for ourselves." And the cry was taken up, and it spread, and the whole hall surged with it. August Crane stood alone at the front of the room, watching his world come apart. And Tessa saw the moment his fear turned to something else. She saw him understand. If the town climbed that mountain, if they saw the house and the garden and the clean, sweet water with their own eyes, then it was finished. All of it. The lie of a lifetime, undone in a single afternoon. Unless there was nothing left up there to find. Crane's eyes went wide, and then, before anyone could move to stop him, he turned and shoved through a side door and was gone into the cold, bright day. Tessa understood in an instant. She understood the way you understand a thing in your blood before your mind has caught it up. The house, Adeline's house, the proof, and Scout. Scout was up there, alone, weak, asleep by the fire in the one place she'd sworn to him was safe. "He's going to the valley," she said. The words tore out of her. "He's going to burn it. He's going to destroy all of it." Her heart had gone to ice. And Scout's up there. She did not wait. But the crowd did not part for her. They pressed in, clutching at her sleeves, shouting their 100 questions all at once, and she had to fight and shove her way through the surging hall before she could break free into the light. And by then, precious minutes were already gone. Behind her, she heard Daniel's voice rise above the roar. "He'll take the cart road, the long way, round the back of the ridge. After him, everyone, up the mountain, now." But Tessa did not run for the road. She ran straight for the slope, the steep face, the hard, direct, brutal way up. The only way that might let her make up the minutes Crane had stolen. Up toward the green. Up toward the home she had found. And the truth she had unburied. And the small, brave dog who had carried her through every dark night of her life. And who lay sleeping now in the path of a desperate and ruined man. The climb that had nearly broken her in the storm. She made it now in a fraction of the time. Fear is a fuel like no other. She went up the slope like something wild, hands and feet finding the holds without thought. Everything left behind, everything narrowed down to one single burning point. Get there first. Get to him first. She crested the last rise, lungs afire, and burst through the curtain of hanging vines into the hollow where Adeline's house stood waiting in the green. And there he was, August Crane. He had reached it before her. The long road had served him after all, for all its winding, while she clawed straight up the cliff. His fine suit was torn at the shoulder, smeared with mud and pine. His silver cane was gone, dropped somewhere along the way. And in his hands, taken from the cold hearth inside, was a burning brand, a length of pitch pine, caught alight, hissing and smoking in the still valley air. He stood before the old wooden walls of the house, the dry, ancient, loved old walls. And he was raising the flame toward them. "Stop!" The word ripped out of Tessa, raw and ragged. Crane spun, and for a moment the two of them simply stood there, facing one another across the wild garden. The powerful man and the thrown-away girl. The one who took, and the one he had thought too small to matter. "You," Crane breathed. His chest heaved. His eyes were wide and wild now, the careful coldness all burned away, leaving something cornered and desperate underneath. "You should have stayed gone," he said. "You should have died up here, the way the story said. The way it was supposed to go." The flame trembled in his grip. "But it doesn't matter. None of it matters. They can climb up here, all they like. They'll find nothing but ash, an old burned-out shack and a wild patch of weeds. No proof, no house, no her." His mouth twisted. "I'll have made it true. After all these years, I'll have finally made the lie come true." "There's a dog inside that house," Tessa said. Her voice shook, but she did not move from where she stood, between him and the door. "He's sick," she said. "He's weak. He can't run. He trusted me that he'd be safe." She took a step forward. "You took everything from me once, my home, my peace. You tried to take him, and I ran rather than let you." Another step. "I'm not running now. Get out of my way, girl." "No." The single word fell between them, hard and flat and final. Crane's face contorted. "You think you've won?" he snarled. "You're nothing. A foundling. A line in a book. The world made you to be used and forgotten. And no scrap of paper, no climbing mob, no senile old fool is going to change that. You are nothing." And Tessa, standing there between a desperate man and everything she loved, felt the strangest thing rise up inside her. Not fear, not anger, a great and steady calm. "You're wrong," she said quietly. "That's the lie you live by. That some people are worth nothing. That love is a weakness, and kindness is a cost, and a person is just a figure to be tallied and crossed out." She shook her head slowly. "But there was a woman who knew better, and she built a home in this valley to prove it. And you've spent your whole life trying to burn that truth down, because you can't stand that it's true." She held his eyes. "I am not nothing," Tessa said. "None of us ever were, and you're about to find out that the whole town knows it now." For behind her, rising up the slope, came a sound. Many feet, many voices, the whole town, pouring up the forbidden mountain, climbing the path no one had dared to climb in 30 years. Led by an old man with a stick and a hard man with fury in his eyes, climbing toward the truth. Crane heard it. His head jerked up. His wild eyes went past Tessa, to the curtain of vines, to the slope beyond, where the first of them were already breaking through into the green. They came into the hollow, and they stopped. And they saw the old house standing whole and real. They saw the wild garden blooming stubborn through the weeds. They saw the clear spring water running sweet over the stones. And they saw August Crane, the great and steady man they had looked up to all their lives, standing there in his torn suit, with a burning brand in his shaking hand, caught in the very act of destroying the proof of his lie. No words were needed. The truth was written plain across the whole green hollow, for every one of them to read. The flame guttered in Crane's hand. He looked at the crowd, at the house, at the girl who stood between him and the dog, unmoving, unafraid. And the great man, the man who had ruled a whole town with fear and silence, seemed all at once to grow small. The brand dropped from his fingers and hissed out in the wet grass. It was over. He had no speech left to give, no smooth words to spin. The lie of his lifetime stood exposed in the morning light, and there was nothing in the world he could do to call it back. The townsfolk closed in around him, not with violence, but with the slow, certain weight of people who have finally seen clearly. They took him in hand, and they led him down off the mountain, out of the valley he had feared and hated and hidden all those years. He did not look back, and the town, at long last, was free of him. Tessa did not watch him go. She had already turned and pushed through the door of the old house and dropped to her knees beside the hearth. Scout lifted his head from his nest of blankets, blinking, sleepy, bewildered by all the noise. He was unharmed. He was safe. She dropped down and gathered him up and pressed her cheek to the top of his head, and for a long moment she just breathed, in and out, feeling him breathe back against her. Alive. Warm. Hers. "It's over," she whispered into his ear. "It's over now. You're safe. We're safe. It's really, finally over." And the small dog, who had carried her through every dark night, who had been her warmth and her courage and her reason, pressed his head against her cheek and sighed and was content. The weeks that followed were a time of quiet, deep, and unhurried change. Crane was gone, and he did not come back. Stripped of his standing, of the fear that had been the whole of his power, he simply faded out of the life of the town like a long shadow at the end of the day. And in the space he left behind, something new began to grow. The town climbed the mountain again and again, and the more they saw of the green valley, the more the old fear loosened its grip. They drank the clean water. They walked among the wild gardens. They stood in the doorway of Adeline's house, and the old ones told the young ones the story of the kind woman who had built it. The story Crane had worked so hard to bury, told now in the open air, where it could finally take root. The home on the hill changed too. The cold rules gave way. The locked doors opened. The harsh and counting spirit of the place was set aside, and in its stead came something Adeline would have known on sight: warmth. The children there began to learn a different lesson than the one they'd been taught in the dark. They began to learn that they were worth keeping. For Tessa, the change was the deepest of all. She did not go back to live behind the white walls. She had no wish to live within walls of any kind, however kind they'd become. Her place was the valley. Walt, his long shame finally laid down, his old heart finally at rest, gave her a corner of the green to call her own, near the spring, near Adeline's house, where the light fell golden through the pines. It was not a gift, he told her gruffly. It was a setting right, a debt paid at last, after 30 years. And there the three of them began to build. The girl who had learned, against all odds, to trust. The old man who had found his courage at the end of a long silence. The hard man who had quit Crane's work the morning after the gathering and found, in the simple turning of the earth, a quiet he had thought lost to him. They did not build to turn a profit. They built a garden. They cleared the wild beds that Adeline had planted so long ago, and they planted them anew. Daniel, who knew the soil, showed Tessa how to read it. Walt, who knew the mountain, taught her what would thrive in the high, clean air. And slowly, row by row, the garden that had run to weeds began to bloom again, as if it had only been waiting all those long years for someone to come back and love it. There was an understanding between Tessa and Daniel, not the kind that needs grand words, something quieter, built in shared work and easy silences, and the deep mutual respect of two people who had each carried their scars up a hard mountain and come down lighter. He never crowded her. He never presumed. He was simply there, steady as the spring, and that was enough. And the children came. That was the part Tessa had not let herself dream of. On warm afternoons, the little ones from the home would climb up the path, the forbidden path, the one no child had dared to walk in 30 years. And they would run wild and laughing through the green valley that had been built so long ago, just for them. They would splash in the clean spring water. They would chase the butterflies through the long grass. They would sit in the doorway of Adeline's house and listen, wide-eyed, while Tessa told them about the kind woman who had dreamed the whole place into being. And their faces, as they listened, their faces looked just like the faces in the photograph, wide and easy and unafraid, worth keeping, and finally, at last, told so. One golden afternoon, near the end of the season, Tessa sat on a warm, flat stone at the edge of the garden and watched her dog. Scout was well now, fully, gloriously well. His coat had grown thick and shining. His body had gone lean and strong. There was no trace left of the shivering, dying creature she had carried up the mountain through the storm. He was chasing a butterfly, leaping and tumbling and pouncing through the tall grass with a wild and foolish joy, snapping at the air, missing every time, and not caring in the least. Tessa watched him, and her chest ached with the fullness of it. She thought of the cave where she had once been so sure she would have to dig his grave, the cold, the fever, the long, terrible night when she had held him and begged the mountain not to take him. And now, here he was, in a garden, in the sun, chasing butterflies in the place a kind woman had built long ago for thrown-away things to be safe. The grave she had so feared had become a garden. The struggle was not entirely over. The winter ahead would be hard. The town's road forward was its own uncertain thing. Life does not tie itself off in a neat bow, not in any story worth the telling. But for the first time in the whole of her life, Tessa felt solid ground beneath her feet. She was not a foundling anymore, not a number, not a thing to be used and crossed off a page. She was a girl who had found a buried truth and carried it down a mountain and given a frightened town back its own forgotten heart. She was part of something now, a small, unlikely family, forged in defiance and rooted deep in the clean, sweet water of a valley that the world had once called forbidden. The light came down gold through the pines. Scout came bounding back to her, tongue lolling, eyes bright, and dropped down panting in the grass at her feet, leaning his warm weight against her leg the way he always had. And Tessa rested her hand on his head and looked out over the blooming garden and the running water and the children's distant laughter drifting up the valley. And she understood at last that the thing she had been searching for her whole life long was not a place she would ever have to climb to, or run from, or fear losing in the night. It was right here. It had been here all along, waiting for her to be brave enough to come and find it. She was home.